Hello and welcome. Joining me today to share the 10 books that had the biggest influence on his life, his thinking, and his work is Creative Alchemist, Earth Steward, Soul Whisperer, Twilight Journeyer, and Storyteller, Dr. Michael Brant DeMaria, a former child protection team psychologist turned Grammy-nominated musician, filmmaker, author, and storyteller. Michael Brant DeMaria has written, directed, and composed original soundtracks for 4 award-winning films and 3 award-winning plays, including his most recent film, The Twilight Cafe. Dr. Michael Brant DeMaria, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sandie. It's great to be here with you.
So you said that books have always been much more than just words on a page for you. Tell me more.
Absolutely, Sandie. I think I used the word when you reached out to me, portals to other worlds. You know, I was a very introverted child. I still am quite introverted. I didn't talk till I was almost 3 and was painfully shy. I had a number of surgeries as a child. Grew up in a pretty loud Italian home, the middle of 3 boys who my brothers were quite loud and boisterous. And I was highly sensitive, deeply empathic, and books from the beginning were portals to another world. They were companions. They were best friends. I remember during a particularly painful time in adolescence, and I remember the person who kind of had hurt me or broke my heart. I just said, just leave me alone. I need to go to my books and my music.
Yeah, just lose yourself in them.
Yes.
I understand that one. Yes, I used to hide under tables and sit in trees just so that I could be alone with my books.
Yes.
So you were a psychologist. What made you make that switch to filmmaker, composer, musician, storyteller?
Well, it's an interesting circle, Sandie, because at 18, I actually felt a call. Music was my first love. You know, when I was 7, and even the music teachers, even as a child, told my parents I had a gift, which they didn't tell me, but my parents actively discouraged. When I was 18, I told my dad I wanted to go to LA and study music and film. And he said, like hell, I'm an Italian immigrant. I came here with nothing, selling rags on the streets of Brooklyn after the Second World War. Your mother grew up in foster homes. You're going to be a doctor. You're my only chance at a doctor. Your brothers are terrible students. You're going to be a doctor. And at the time, I didn't know he had tried to get into Columbia Medical School 3 times and did not. So there was a little bit of that living through me. So I really spent, weeks, months, like, what kind of doctor can I be? Because I was a dutiful altar boy. I was, a pleasing young man, and I didn't have enough sense of self to buck my dad, so I wouldn't have survived in LA anyway. But I found out about music therapy. And I said, well, Dad, how about if I become a psychologist and study music therapy, art therapy, poetry, play therapy? And he said, well, if you get your PhD, I guess it'll be okay, but it's still not a real doctor. So I think my whole life, everything I've done is an apprenticeship for the next thing. I loved my work as a Jungian-oriented psychologist and creative arts therapist, and did all kinds of seeing how creativity is inherently healing and transforms suffering into compassion and wisdom. At the same time, from the beginning of my practice, I was doing meditation tapes, and I would create my own healing music. It was my justification, to keep my music going, was I'd do meditation tapes or stop smoking tapes, but I would do my own music. And this is back when we just had little audio cassettes. So the other aspect was, at 31, I did a profound vision quest with a native teacher and elder, a vision quest without food or water. And I first heard the sound of the native flute, and I'd played percussion and piano up in that till that time. But when I heard the flute, it just broke my heart open, and it helped me. I was grieving. I was going through a lot of grief and secondary trauma from working with extreme cases of child abuse and neglect. And I just started pursuing this making music with my breath through this very earthy instrument made out of wood. And it healed me, it changed me. And then I started doing these talks. I wrote a couple books, but I'd go do these talks. And when I would share about my, book or do a speaking engagement, I'd always bring my flute. And people would always, they come up afterwards, say, your book was okay, your talk was all right, but do you have an album with just your flute music? So it took me about 10 years to get the hint. And in 2003, I finally released my first album, just kind of on a lark with just instrumental music. And lo and behold, that took on a life of its own. So it almost kind of guided me as my music started taking off and touching people in ways. And to me, it's an extension. I work as a psychologist, healer, meditation, yoga teacher, shamanic breathwork facilitator, because my music wouldn't be what it is if I hadn't applied my trade in human suffering for over 3 decades. So I think it has a lot of sincerity and genuineness and depth because of my work as a psychologist. And then the film, to me, was a dream that felt just somewhere deep inside, coming back to books, the visual storytelling, right? So moving from the story on the page to story on the screen. And so at 57, I guess I was, 5 years ago, 5-6 years ago, I lived my childhood dream, went to LA and went to a very intensive kind of guerrilla making film school in LA for 2.5 months. And I was like a little kid in a candy shop, and it was just so powerful. And again, 3 of my films have to do with suicide prevention. They're about people being on that cliff or bridge of despair, and what keeps us off is each other. So I feel that these are different mediums that are all connected to trying to help people wake up and clear their minds, open their hearts, embrace their soul, and heal their life. So I feel I'm simply using other vehicles for doing the healing work I always did as a psychologist.
Yeah, healing, happens in so many different ways.
Yes.
And you're right. You could read a book and suddenly, you've changed your perception about something and healed something that's been bothering you for a long time.
Yes.
I love that.
Yes,
Good
absolutely.
for you.
Thank
Good
you so
for you.
much.
So let's talk about your books. Unlike most people, you have divided your books into, certain age groups when you were looking for certain things.
Yes.
So we're going to start with ages 12 to 17, which you called early awakenings. And, what's interesting about your books is you seem to have been such a serious reader at a very early age.
Yes.
We'll find out as we go through these books.
Yes.
Because it surprised me that someone at that age would have been attracted to these books.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Oh, I thought you froze. I thought you froze. It looked like the screen froze for a minute. I'm so sorry.
Didn't
yes,
it this?
absolutely.
I hope it didn't at yours.
Yeah. So absolutely. I was often accused of being 7 going on 30, and as a psychologist, I could say I was a bit of a parentified child. I have a floor to ceiling bookcases in 4 walls of a study, a library in my home. And my dad had, a study with 2 walls full of books, but I was always moved by his bookshelves. And my father, having been Italian, growing up in Italy, grew up, learning Greek and Latin. And my child, he had a classical education. So my childhood stories, bedtime stories, he would read me, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Divine Comedy. And because these were what he had, and not to mention, I was hearing Gregorian chants and Renaissance music. Now, my brothers would refuse. Say, Dad, that's boring. Go talk to Michael. But I ate it up, and I do think partly at 7, I had this one surgery where I had a near-death experience and kind of had a glimpse of the other side. And from that point on, I always felt death was over my shoulder, and I think that just made me I grew up way too fast in some ways. And in other ways, it just gave me a lot of poignancy. And I was just interested in those big questions. So absolutely, I often get, as you'll see now, when I was 15, reading the history of Western philosophy that whole summer.
Yeah. Well, we'll start with the first one on your list, which is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. You read this at age 12, and the book was actually published in 1952. What moved you about this book?
I remember it so well. I remember the class. We were able to pick a book, and sixth grade, I guess, 6th or 7th grade. I want to say 6th grade. I see that book, and I remember reading it and being hooked. I think, and this is something that's been true for me my entire life, is books that are kind of an autobiographical story of the soul, or kind of a soul encounter. I love, there's so many books to pick from, but Hermann Hesse, Hesse, just that oftentimes the first person books about the soul's journey. And The Old Man and the Sea, I think I've always felt either 8 or 80. I either feel like a little kid or an old man myself. And there was something very poignant about this man at the period of time in his life, going out on this little boat and just finding this amazing fish that was going to be such an incredible catch, and had been going where he wasn't catching anything. And then out there, away from the shoreline, catching this fish, wanting to bring it home, and then the trials and tribulations, of your great goals you're getting in life, and then it gets eaten by sharks all the way in. There was something, I think, that it wasn't. I think at a young age, I was skeptical of all of the fairy tales, the happy ever afters, and there was something about this book and the other ones you'll see here. I wanted truth. I wanted the truth about how hard life was. Somehow I felt, and both my parents had tremendously difficult childhoods that they never talked about. Never talked about. I really feel like I carried a lot of their grief, because they just wanted a nice, sweet, happy Beaver Cleaver 50s family, 60s family. And I was the empath in the family, and I was carrying the heaviness. And so when I found books that allowed me to say, oh, this is more what life's about, and we all need to be more honest about how difficult it is and how much suffering there actually is. And also the resiliency. I think something about his incredible resiliency, and then at the end, he's happy for the journey. He's happy for the journey, even though he didn't get the fish back. And there's something about his relationship with the young man that's so touching, and the love that they share for each other is a theme for me.
Book number 2, you read at 13. Published in 1970, and consistently appears in the top 10 books of all time on this show. Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. I wonder if he really truly understands. I mean, he knows from the numbers that he's sold a lot of books, but I wonder how many people get the opportunity to tell him what it really meant to them.
Agreed. I think there are those writers who are just channeling, like The Alchemist, right, by Paulo Coelho, that there's these, that almost, as I feel like the best pieces I've composed, I've been played more than I played. I have, my friend Mark Nepo talks about poetry. He says, I don't write them, I retrieve them. And I think this is when an author or a musician, filmmaker, we're at our highest gift, is that we are listening and retrieve these stories, because there is something otherworldly about Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Again, I remember I was in my older brother's room, and came across this book, and I remember reading it in one sitting on his bed. For some reason, I want to say he was out of town or something. And I was I was just mesmerized and then fell asleep. And I remember waking up and saying, did I dream that? And then I look at, and it's like, oh no, that's a real book. It's actually, that actually is in that book. And I still have, like, I have such chill bumps right now, or my teacher would often say truth bumps or a breeze from the other world.
Yes.
And Jonathan Livingston Seagull is like that. And my dearest best friend to this day, Bill Schultz, when we, it's like, you just know each other when you finally have a chance to, meet someone and it had that impact on them. And it's as if you've had a similar dream together or something, or traveled to a different world, a similar world together. And that's something we continue to share together is these favorite books, that being probably in the top, 2 or 3.
You mentioned Mark Nepo. He's been on the show. Lovely man. I've interviewed him several times. And what he said about, you just retrieve them. Isn't that true too of music? I mean, there are many musicians, singers who've said the song just appeared.
Absolutely. And in fact, in many indigenous cultures, particularly African culture, but you find it throughout much of the indigenous world, that they say the music is all around us. It's in the air, and that a musician is a channel for that music. And that is my experience. Many people don't know that all of my music, none of the music on my albums are written down. They are layered improvisations. So I create kind of these are my flutes behind me and some of my other instruments. And I create a sacred setting and I layer different, almost like a painter. I think of it almost like sound painting. And it's about listening deeply, deep listening and allowing whatever's moving through us. My great mentor in music, I say Mark is kind of my David Darling of poetry for me with my writing, but David Darling, I studied closely with him, apprenticed with him for 4 years, and just a master cellist, and performed with Coleman Barks, playing Rumi, and God rest his soul, passed away a few years ago, but his music was very similar. So much of his music would just flow out of him in the recording studio, and you hear it. He's so, we would say, inside the music. And so 100%, I love that you get that, Sandie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the world is full of music.
Yes.
I remember Dr. Jeffrey Thompson, I think it is. He was a chiropractor, but he's also done a lot of music, which is, sounds. And he was granted permission, I think, by NASA or whoever's in charge of that, to capture the music of the planets.
Yes.
Which has to be like the music of the spheres, doesn't it?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
the sounds that the planets make. It is all around us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Beautifully put.
So book number 3, The History of Western Philosophy, by the Welsh philosopher, historian, logician, mathematician, advocate for social reform, pacifist, prominent rationalist, Bertrand Russell. Sir Bertrand Russell.
Yes,
and you read this at age 15.
Yes, God bless Bertrand. And to give my father credit, so I had moved from Connecticut. So I was, grew up I was very fortunate. The little town we grew up in Connecticut had, the public education was like a Montessori school. It was just a wonderful education. And I was fortunate enough to be in the same house, and the same. I was surrounded by 100 acres of woods. I would have been something like out of Last of the Mohicans. And I was really fortunate. And at 15, my parents moved me to the deep South. We say it was Florida, but actually Pensacola, Florida, which where I am on the Gulf Coast, is 2.5 hours from New Orleans. So it's the deep South. And in 1977, it was more like Selma, Alabama. And I didn't play lacrosse. I had my first girlfriend. I was very depressed. And they moved me in the middle of summer. I didn't know anyone. And, it seemed like in the middle of high school, I had worked so hard for all these things, and I was just lost. And I remember, my dad saying, so my dad actually bought me that copy. Now I looked at it, I found it, Sandie, and it actually, to, Michael, who loves a physical and intellectual challenge, I have a feeling this book will be important for you this summer. And he signed it and dated it. And I mean, it gets me emotional, for all the tough stuff my dad put me through. He was a brilliant man and he loved me dearly. And we had a particularly close bond. And even, when he passed away at 92 a few years ago, we were both, we would read, books on like DNA sequencing and David Bohm and the holographic mind. He really wanted to be a physicist, but I became a chemical engineer. He helped to, discover dissolving sutures and all of that. So he was a brilliant man. And he had a great respect for Bertrand Russell. We had the entire history of philosophy by Will Durant, but there was no way I was going to read those 30 volumes that summer. So it's a beautiful, concise history, but it's still a tome. It's over 1,000 pages, I think. But I read it cover to cover. I just was just so, and from the beginning with the pre-Socratics, but in particular Socrates stuck out for me. And I think it just gave me something to sink my teeth into. And I was listening to classical music, and I was listening to his Gregorian chants and Renaissance minstrel music, and just a fish out of water in this deep South town. But it was like oxygen for me. And I remember in particular, Socrates' dictum, know thyself. And of course, these were both on the Oracle of Delphi, know thyself in moderation in all things. Yes. But I realized I didn't know myself more deeply. And I decided that in Bertrand Russell talks about philosophia, it's the love of wisdom. And I think it gave me an understanding of who I was at a deep level. And it also was like, I didn't want to invest in anything that could be taken away from me anymore. And that was another thing Socrates would kind of, the unexamined life is not worth living. I think I read Thoreau that year too, I don't want to die without having lived. So I became this real, deep existential, transcendental, philosopher. And it really was, it gave me something to begin to focus on. And I'll always be grateful to my dad. And I cherish that copy of that book, because it was it was so formative, Sandie, and it was kind of a ground. And to this day, I even think when I went to become a psychologist, if I knew I could have been an applied philosopher at the time, I think you can do that today with the internet, but not back in the early 80s when I was coming out with my PhD in psychology. I really wanted to get a PhD in philosophy, but I wanted to work with people in the world. I didn't want to just live in the ivory tower. So, and the doctoral program I went to, Duquesne University, is a center for existential phenomenological psychology. So it was like getting a degree in philosophy. We had courses on Heidegger and Nietzsche and Derrida. So it was really, to this day, I love that I have a PhD, a doctor of philosophy. I mean, so yeah, it was a formative book. When you first reached out about it, I knew that was the first book that came to me, actually.
Wow. Our journeys are just amazing.
Yes.
It never ceases to amaze me and fascinate me when I listen to people's journeys, the turns they've taken, the things that happen to them at such a young age when one wouldn't expect them. We have to say, there's a purpose there, there's a purpose that we don't even know, but it drives us through our lives.
Amen. What we would, call the soul, right? That I love, I had Michael Mead on my podcast a few months ago, and I love his work about, it is the depth of the soul, or James Hillman, that if you look at the life lived backwards, that there isn't this autobiography of the soul, that there is this soul print that's so individually unique, one of a kind. And as Mark would say, that how does a flower bloom. It turns itself inside out. And I think we're spending our entire journeys, Sandie, right, getting to a place where we can turn ourselves inside out and discover in the process our soul's mission, and I see it as a river because it is not a straight line, right? It's a twisting, turning river that for me is moving through our hearts.
Yeah, well said. So book number 4 is Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Informal Talks on Zen Meditation and Practice by Shunryu Suzuki. You were age 16 and this book was published in 1970.
Yes, I have these chill bumps because it's so connected to my soul brother, Bill Schultz, who is today my best friend. And I moved from Connecticut. He had moved from Virginia, and we were both fishes out of water. He was missing playing hockey. I was missing playing lacrosse. And I remember the first time we sat down and we talked for like 4 or 5, 6 hours. And it was like just the resonation of seeing and being seen by someone who gets you, right? It's such a blessing. And we were both, 15 going on 30. And he had when he had gone to the governor's school in Virginia, which was kind of an honors program in the summer before he had to move. And he took a course on Zen Buddhism, and that was one of the books they read. And, he said, I want you to read this. And there's something in particular I want you to notice. And I want to see if you get it the way I did. And of course, it's a fabulous book, and it started my meditation practice, and I was teaching about Socrates because he really didn't know much about Western philosophy. So I was, we were comparing notes, and there's this one page, no, it's 2 pages that are empty except for this little calligraphied image of a fly on the top right side of the other page. But you're just reading along, and all of a sudden there's a blank page and a blank page with an image of a fly in the top corner. No explanation. There's nowhere else in the book. It just, and I've never read another book to this day. And from that, I just had this huge laugh. I just laughed, and it was kind of that Zen moment where, like, when you finally allow the intellectual mind to release and just have that sense of awe and wonder and mystery. And to this day, it makes me happy. And I would just a couple years later meet my Zen teacher who just passed away. We had a funeral for him on Saturday, 43 years from 18 on. And that book prepared me for meeting him and spending a life having a chance to work with him.
There are no accidents.
No.
Not
God incidences, synchronicities. Yes.
Yeah. So book number 5, The Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. You read this at age 17. And this book was published sometime between the 6th and 3rd centuries BCE. That just blows your mind.
Oh, it does. It does. Yes, the Tao Te Ching, the Book of the Way. It's the closest thing to a Bible for me. It's that same, the one I have, the Feng edition, I still have. It's always in my bedroom somewhere. And, as the story goes, Lao Tzu was considered one of the wisest men at the time. And similar to today, right? He was just disgusted that nobody was listening to him and the world was just going to hell. And he said, I'm taking off. I'm going back to the mountains. And it's said, right, that a guard is at the edge of the city as he was heading to the mountain said, Master, please, could you just write down what you feel is most important about living a life? And so the story goes that he wrote the Tao Te Ching down and then left. And, I think I mentioned to you that I was a personal trainer at a gym at the time, and I was always an athlete, and I loved that. And there was this gentleman that would come and work out at really odd times, like when nobody else was there. And Dennis Fitch. And one day he just hands me a piece of paper. It's very kind of Taoist Zen-like, where he just handed me a piece of paper and it says Tao Te Ching, Feng Edition. And so I ended up getting it. And I said, tell me, why did you think? He goes, there's something about you. I think this book is important to you. And I teach, this is him talking. I teach Tai Chi, and Tai Chi is the physical embodiment of this book. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to teach you some. So I went on to also learn Tai Chi and Qigong, and yet it was even more than anything else I had read up till that point, as so many teachers will tell you, Mark, my Zen teacher, that all words, all teachings are fingers pointing at the moon, right? And there's something about the Tao Te Ching that lets you get a glimpse of the moon without the finger. And that just from the very beginning, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. And I think as a musician and a poet, that really helps me, because it's that which goes beyond anything we can say about it. And there's nothing wrong with attempting to say those things, but it's such a reminder of staying tremendously humble about this larger, greater reality that it goes beyond the duality of this world. And the last thing I want to say about that is that, the Tao is that which is actually unmanifest. As soon as something comes into the world, it turns into Tai Chi, or yin yang. It comes into the dualistic. We can't not have that in space and time. But that when I just rest, when I can rest in my meditation practices, my music, etc., in the Tao, it's where I feel most at home.
Well, now we move into another era of your life, the ages 18 to 31, when you were searching for meaning. And book number 6 is Memories, Dreams, Reflections by C.G. Jung. You were 18 when you read this book. And this one was published in 1962.
Yeah, gosh, it makes me tear up a bit, because I was born in 1962, and I felt, it was the year after he passed away, and that sense of connection to that man and his work is uncanny. I remember even in a few years previously in high school, in the library, there was the portable Jung, and I remember just from a distance I saw the Jung in red, and it just leapt off the shelf, but I didn't read it. So I was at the Honors College of Florida, and I was taking a class in personality theory, and we were all supposed to present something on one of the theorists. And it was really interesting that the teacher, again, no accidents. I was going through a very difficult emotional time. I was 18, but I was really a sophomore, standing as a college student. I had started college early. I was taking dual enrollment as a teenager, and I had been going through kind of an extreme state of consciousness. I've always had I was a chemistry math major for my dad. I was supposed to be, the orthopedic surgeon, the cardiologist. I hadn't told him I wanted to study music and film yet. So I was still being the dutiful altar boy. And this was the only class that was speaking to my heart and my soul. And literally, not to, because I tell it in this new book that's not out yet called The Way of Twilight, my new book, but in my organic chemistry text, it's like the molecules were talking to me. I was having what I call a soulcosis. It was kind of an extreme state of consciousness. And my roommate was Bill, who we'd been close friends now for a few years, and he kind of loved me through it. But as soon as I began reading this book, it was like I'd never read a book like this. It was kind of not only conversationally, but he's writing it from a place of tremendous interiority. And he himself, I said, wow, this guy, he's well respected for the most part. I learned later a lot of people thought he was nuts, but, we're studying him. He's in the textbook, and and he's talking about literally, having these kind of psychotic-like experiences during his confrontation with the unconscious. And he's playing with little figurines in his 30s, and he's having imaginary conversations. And he has something in the back of the book called the Septem Sermones de Mortuum, the 7 sermons of the dead. And it was all very kind of, occult kind of and esoteric. And I was like, the figure ground shift was this. What really helped me in that book was he was, number one, saying that these extreme states of consciousness were not a sign of pathology, and they can be a gift if understood correctly in the right way, and that they were basically a journey, which also made sense to me in the other things I had read, Dante and, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and just kind of understanding things mythically, mythopoetically. So literally, that's when I decided I went from wanting to be a philosopher to being a Jungian-oriented psychologist. It was like, okay, that's what I'm going to be doing. And to this day, I still have that copy. And it was what led me to end up going to Duquesne to get my PhD, where there was a Jungian psychologist on faculty, and I took a number of directed studies in Jungian psychology with him.
Mm. That's another book that comes up again and again. Mm. Yeah. Probably in the top 20, I would say.
It's
number
powerful.
7.
Yes.
Also, at the age of 18, you read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which was published in 1946. What can you say about this book? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting, Sandie. For some reason, just recently, I decided to listen to the audible version of it. And, I've often given it as gifts, and I've got a number of copies. And it just so happened I started listening to it in Europe. It's a big day when they honor I think it was the 80th anniversary of the opening of Auschwitz. And 70th or 80th, I can't remember. But basically, I think the two things in that personality theories course, this was also an option to read. And, my father went through the Second World War, and I didn't hear a lot of the details until later in his life, but there was a lot of trauma he went through. And as a highly sensitive, empathic young man, that man's inhumanity to man was just incomprehensible. And here was this man who was talking about it in a way that I think the powerful thing was that, he's surviving. And how did he survive? And the two keys there is his, key that, Freud's talking about, the instinct for sex and propagation and the death instinct and aggression and the will to power for others, and for Jung even, more of kind of this search for the soul. But he's saying the search for meaning, finding meaning, and logotherapy. And that because he had a vision of how he was going to write this book or finish this book on the other side of this. And also here he is talking about the power of humor, that even in the darkness, that the ones who survived, they weren't necessarily stronger. They weren't necessarily bigger. They were able to have a sense of humor. They were able to have a vision of something other and something future. And to me, a sense of heart about where this might be taking them. And I just remember, sometimes I would get nauseous reading it because it's so, so brutal, but also it was like, it put all my first world problems as a late teen in perspective, right? It was like, oh, Michael, get over yourself, and start being grateful for what you have. And then it was also, what is my meaning what is my meaning of, and I realized from that point on, I was also on a quest for meaning.
It's a book that I don't think anyone could read and not be changed.
Yes. Yeah.
Book number 8, The Book of the Vision Quest, Personal Transformation in the Wilderness by Stephen Foster. You were 31 when you read this book, which was published in 1988. Did you write about your first vision quest?
Yes. Again, truth bumps. Stephen also, I was so fortunate to have a chance to work with him. I tell the full story in this new book, The Way of Twilight, but the synchronicities, how I ended up on this Blackfoot reservation with my teacher, is still uncanny. And I was completely unprepared, and I was looking to get some guidance. And I was working with the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, Michael Harner's group, and there was a little brochure about this gentleman, Bill Plotkin, who lived in Durango, Colorado, and who guided vision quests. And I called him and said, I'm about to do this. And this is way before Bill did any of his books. And it was almost like the Tao Te Ching Feng edition. He basically said, I don't have much time right now, but the Book of the Vision Quest, Stephen Foster, get it. And which I did. And I read it in its entirety. I may have read it on the flight up to Montana. And I remember it was the book most similar to my experience of reading Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. I inhaled that book. And it was speaking to me on so many different levels. I think Stephen's raw, honest, how he talks so much about his own dissolution of self and how he kind of stumbled into this ancient practice that is pan-cultural, the soul initiation. Vision quest is one term. In fact, there's really a British anthropologist came up with the term vision quest. Actually, most of the native terms would be translated as something like the lament in the wild or the lamentation. You go and cry for a vision. And it prepared me physically, emotionally, spiritually for the most intense experience of my life. And I think it really gave me a chance. It would have been much harder to have the context, like my mind, when you're going into an extreme experience like that, you have to give something for your logical mind to hold on to, or maybe to help you let go. And so I'm deeply grateful for that book, and was so grateful years later to have a chance to work directly with Stephen Foster and his School of Lost Borders, which Stephen is gone now, but his wife Meredith Little and the School of Lost Borders is still in existence in California.
Book number 9, We, Understanding the Psychology of Romantic Love by Robert A. Johnson. You were 34 when you read this one, which was published in 2009. Yes.
Robert became a dear friend, mentor, teacher, and he also wrote the foreword to my book, Ever Flowing On. This book was his third. He wrote a book called He, and then the next one was She. But He was on masculine psychology, She on feminine psychology, and then We on romantic love. He worked directly with Jung, which was he was kind of an interesting version of a Jungian analyst. He was in the very first class of the Jung Institute, but he only stayed 1 year, and partly was that Jung said, Jung, there was a few of his dreams. He said, no, this is not the way you need to learn. These are things you need to do on your own. And so he had a way in his books of speaking directly to your heart without all the jargon of the Jungian lexicon. And We in particular I probably have reread that book 4 or 5 times. And it was a standard that I would give out to couples I was working with, friends, family. And, this year I will be 48 years in relationship with my wife, and married 43 come July. We were high school sweethearts at 15. We broke up twice before we got married, but that book, along with Eric Fromm's The Art of Loving, gave me an understanding of the difference between projection, which I think, most of our culture confuses projection with love, which is really simply seeing an idealized version of ourselves. We're actually projecting our own soul onto the person. We actually erase the individuality of that person, versus loving a separate individual human being full of light and dark. And he uses a few different myths in that book that's just really speaks to the heart. And the metaphor I love most is kind of, he contrasts like this cotton candy love, right, versus stirring oatmeal love. The love that, is like an empty carbohydrate, and it might get you a little high, but it gets you sick over time, and there's no nourishment. Now, there's things you can do with projection if you skillfully understand it, but the idea of a stirring oatmeal love is something that a love that endures the tests of time and that seasons both people, that you move through in every relationship, a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winter. And our culture is obsessed with spring and summer, but not many people know how to endure in fall and winter. And Robert just had a mythopoetic way of communicating it, where it wasn't just sticking it out, but really understanding the subtle ways in which you're feeding and growing and deepening your soul by being in long-term relationship as a spiritual practice.
Indeed. These kinds of books, they should be given to us in school.
Amen. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I would have from elementary school feeling groups, learning how to identify, share, and can you imagine if we had these kind of books all the way through instead of just reading, writing, arithmetic? Yeah, we do not cultivate the heart at all in the West for the most part.
And look where it's got us.
Amen.
These books now more than ever.
Yes, absolutely.
Are needed.
Yes.
So the final book on your list, and now you've gone to the age of 60 plus, and you categorize that as a new relationship with the body. And the book, number 10, is Life on Land, the story of Continuum, the world-renowned self-discovery and movement method, published in 2001. How is this different from many of the other movement books?
Oh, goodness. If you haven't read it, anybody out there but Sandie, you have to read it. Emily Conrad, oh my gosh, I'll get emotional, but she is up there, in my opinion, with Jung, Foster, Frankl. This is a paradigm-shifting book. And I guess to say what's different about Continuum as a movement practice, she worked with spinal cord injury people. She was profoundly able to get them to begin connecting and moving again, which is interesting. There's this gentleman, Ed Jackson, you can find online. There's an incredible film called From Millimeters to Mountains, where he recovered in a similar way. But she was convinced that, and there's a lot of embryologists that will say this now too, that what's happening in the embryo, what's happening in the womb when we're developing, is such an extraordinary unfolding. And the way we unfold is kind of this ontogenesis, which means the genesis of being, where she talks about these gestures, which are kind of organically unfolding, because it's an ocean, it's a mini ocean, and that we have the capacity throughout our lives, like those stem cells in the very beginning, we still have stem cells, to begin to heal and transform our relationship to our body. If we see the body as an organic fluid unfolding, she talks over and over again about our oceanic origins. And so the simple understanding of Continuum, and it's a pretty thick book, but again, I love she's so raw and real. And the publisher actually she really didn't want to write a book. And he said, you really, almost like the Tao Te Ching, like, you really need to write this down. And she goes, it took her forever to write it. And he kept encouraging her. And it's just so raw and real. And she had a painful and difficult life and overcoming abuse and all kinds of other things. But her dedication to her spiritual practice of movement and then discovering continuum, you might think of as, well, I know you had Linda Starwolf and shamanic breathwork on. She's my teacher as well, and I'm a shamanic breathwork facilitator. What's different is the kind of music that they use continuum. There's some similarities but differences, but you're allowing your body, and the continuum is that a continuum between our oceanic origins, all life emerged out of the ocean, and that the way we can most powerfully heal and evolve is reconnecting with our oceanic fluid origins. So you're using music. Both practices will use some of my music, but basically eyes closed. They call it dives. Instead of breath work, they call it deep dives or diving. And there'll be a playlist of music, and you get a place where you feel comfortable to allow your body. We're thinking about going back to David Darling's music or Mark Neatbo's poetry. You are allowing your body to unfold and move, wind or unwind without logical, intention. The idea is to begin to listen where the body wants to unfold itself. Like, it will tap into where the tension, difficulties, etc. are, and to be with your body for an hour or two in one of these dives in a way that connects you to coherence. The idea of bringing coherence back to the fluid origins of your body. So it's getting out of your head, it's getting into your breath, getting into your heart, getting into your somatic experience of your body. And so I'm about to turn 63 now, and it's changed my relationship to my body. I'm feeling, I was kind of suffering from a lot of different, lifetime of being an athlete and other kind of challenges. And Emily's book was just profound, I think both an initiation and awakening to, I think, in part of reading her, Sandie, is it's like a sense of, when you read something, you say, you knew it, but you didn't have words for it. That's kind of how it feels. So I'm a huge Emily Conrad fan. She passed away in her early 90s, but I highly recommend anybody who's interested, and just even checking out Continuum. There's lots of videos online, but it's my favorite form of body work currently.
Well, that's your 10 best list. Let's talk a little bit about you. You have pretty much dedicated a huge part of your life to exploring what you call the way of twilight. And you mentioned that that's your next book, embracing the paradoxes of life and death. What is it about this subject that really fascinates you?
Well, I think that, partly that near-death experience I had at 7 that let me see how thin the veil really is. And more so on my vision quest at 31, part of the vision that came to me, it's taken me years to kind of, if I can distill it, I would say that in the deep inmost center of the human heart, there lies a spring. It is a spring that emerges at the edge of life and death, night and day, joy and suffering, male and female, madness and creativity. And it is the spring of the great loving, and the great loving is capable to heal the deepest wound and calm the greatest fear. And for me, this twilight in between is the place that our culture has lost. We are so polarized. And you may know the mandorla, sometimes called the Vesica Piscis, the two overlapping circles. This is was a favorite of Robert Johnson's exercises. I actually have a dance I do with people where we actually sketch out it on the ground, and people will dance two sides of of an opposition until they dance on the inside and find a resolution. So the idea, and think about twilight, that it's this hour or two in the morning and the evening every day where we have this golden hour. And it's where the light, a lot of Native people will say, this is the house of shattered or broken light. And what's interesting is this is actually, physicists will tell you this too, that no event can happen in perfect symmetry, that the Big Bang occurred because there's a little bit more matter than antimatter. And the idea of the house of broken light, if an indigenous person makes something too perfect, they'll put a flaw in it. So the idea is to honor our vulnerability, honor our imperfection. And there's something about, at sunset, at twilight, that white light is refracted and we can start to see all the different colors of like the unity and diversity, which is suffering a tremendous loss right now, is so critical and important. So for me, I think, having a foot in both worlds most of my life, but particularly since my near-death experience, has taught me that when we keep death over our shoulder, we live more fully. We have more compassion. We have more wisdom. We have more vulnerability. And that's what connects us in so many different ways. And I think in particular, because even whether it's a sunset or sunrise, we love the sunrises of our life, right? When we're at the beginning of something and we have these new projects, but we also can learn just as much when the sun's going down and we're facing dark times and the difficulties arise, and to remember that twilight has wisdom to teach us as well. I think Mark is really good on this, about that we tend to, he actually used my music in his audio course, Reduced to Joy, based upon his book of poetry, Reduced to Joy. And that joy, yes, can come when things are going well, but it also comes when we have been devastated, and comes down to what is most essential, or when Pema Chodron would say, if you want to find out what's indestructible, continue to expose yourself to total annihilation. And Mark, in his cancer journey, of the idea that the different emotions are the waves, but this joy, I might say it might even be more like Ananda, the bliss that might come, that is this fundamental ground, which is a groundless ground, sourceless source, Allah, the Tao, that if we can be in touch with this fluid arising and dissolving without attachment, we can taste that kind of joy, that kind of bliss. Jung had at Bollingen, he would have the carved, called or uncalled, God is there, and that idea that we're being held even when we feel desolate and alone, and again the footprints, right? Why, Lord, when I was most alone did you abandon me, and my son, my precious son? Those are the times that I carried you.
Well, I want to talk about one more book before we close, and this is the book that you wrote in 1992, Horns and Halos, Towards the Blessings of Darkness. We are in a place right now where there is much darkness, much hatred. And I think this particular book was really all about looking at the psychology of hatred.
Yes.
Give me just a little bit of something that's in this book that will tell us that we've all got to read it.
Bless your heart. Thank you. So this was my first book. It was published by Academic Press, and it was kind of an amplified version of my dissertation, which was on the phenomenology of hating, on love-hate relationships. And I review so much of the literature on human emotions and Erich Fromm's Anatomy of Human Destructiveness when he was trying to understand what happened in Germany and with Hitler. So yes, it's very timely, actually. We're kind of looking at trying to re-release it. And I think the thing that's most powerful, I wanted to ask the question, is what is so hateful about hate? And that most people describe hate in what it's not. And I wanted to understand phenomenologically. Let's just describe it without throwing rocks at it. And the bottom line is that hatred grows out of a sense of, and that's why some kind of violation. So, and also it tends to be something about some kind of deeper, intimate violation. So the idea is that hate usually comes from some trauma. But what happens is, and this is very key, there's a difference between an emotion of hate, which is raw and hot, almost like a rage, and the attitude of hatred, which is where real, we might say, human evil comes from, in the sense of which is cold and calculating. So what happens is somebody who had some violation but couldn't cry, couldn't process it, couldn't retrieve their humanity, or I would say their inner child or their soul. They suffer what I call soul loss. And that soul, because soul is that organ of not only meaning, but connection. So the ego wants acceptance and approval. The soul wants authentic connection to heart to heart. We even say the heart is kind of the doorway to the soul. So what happens is if that wound gets covered over and the person's not able to access that wound anymore, it will turn into the attitude of hatred. And then that person, that's what we kind of call a personality disorder. And that person no longer can access that woundedness. They can't access the wound that triggered that hate, where if they were able to express it at the time and have somebody lovingly help them get back to coherence with their heart, then it's just a wave on that ocean we're talking about. And that's where I say, I wrote it because I remember, as a Catholic kid, I would tell my brothers after they beat me up, I hate your guts. And my mom said, no, you don't hate them. You're angry at them. No, I hate them. And it created this problem, like, oh, either something really wrong with me, or, maybe that misunderstand what it is. So I actually wanted to take the evil out of the emotion, the warm emotion of when it first arises, that can be processed and healed and reintegrated, where that person gets back into coherence with their caretakers, their loved ones, versus where it becomes part of the personality and the person doesn't remember anymore. And then they become more and more sealed over from their heart. And that's what we talk about as somebody who's become antisocial or sociopathic. They lost the capacity to be empathic. And then people aren't even people to them anymore because they've become cold and calculating. But that's really the attitude of hatred versus the emotion of hating. Like I say, hating is a verb. Hatred is a noun. So it might sound like a kind of a subtle difference, but it's a difference that makes all the difference. Because if you're violated, if you're wounded, you can, all of a sudden say, I hate that person, and that's why it's also so difficult right now. And, Fromm talks about this, the anatomy of human destructiveness. How do we fight the monsters of today without becoming the monster we fight? Right? It's a real challenge and difficulty. And the masters of that are, Gandhi, Mandela, Bishop Tutu, the Dalai Lama, who have suffered so much and yet capable of, fighting injustice while maintaining their humanity. And I think that's the real challenge we have today, Sandie.
I agree with you, and I think that your book should be relaunched, because when I look at the world, and I'm not taking any sides whatsoever, but when I look at the world, actually, I do take sides. It's the sides of the children.
Yes. Oh, that's beautiful.
From wherever they are, is that we are creating exactly that. We are not giving these children anything that they need to heal through the trauma that many are experiencing. And in 15, 20 years' time, we're going to see the results of that.
Yes, beautifully put. My mentor, who just passed, my Zen teacher of 43 years, his most recent book just got published post his passing, Health, Happiness, and Freedom. And there's one, and the last part of the subtitle is, and to save the children. And, in Native culture, we say the way we live will affect our children's, 7 generations to come. And this is the legacy we really are up against. And, we have been out of step with that practice for a long time. But thank you. I'm so glad. I thought you were going to pick one of my other books, but what a perfect book. I'm so glad you took a look.
It's perfect for its time, for this time.
Yeah, it would be makes really good sense. And it's something that is very timely. So thank you for that, Sandie. I'm grateful for you mirroring that back to me.
So, Michael, one last question before we close. Steve Jobs famously, you know what I'm going to say, gave out Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi to all of the people who attended his memorial service. What book would you give to the people who attend yours?
Oh, goodness. That's so, I would have thought I would have said the Tao Te Ching, but The Prophet by Khalil Gibran.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, I didn't think of putting that on my top 10 list because it's so precious to me. It's so precious. And it's always right there by the Tao Te Ching. I read it. I read on marriage when I do marriage ceremonies for people. I read on death when I do funerals for people. I read it to parents, the young children. That was a channeled book by that dear man. The Prophet by...
And maybe you didn't put it there because it is, like some of the others you've mentioned, consistently in the top 10 recommendations of all time on our list. And we've probably got about 3,000 books now that have been recommended by our guests. Beautiful. So it didn't need... something else needed to go up the scale a bit.
Well, and I love that it spontaneously came to me when you asked that question, and I wasn't expecting that question, so
I thought you were.
I'm really, really glad you asked, and I'm really glad we could land on that beautiful, moving book.
Michael Brant DeMaria, thank you so much for adding your 10 best list to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations.
Thank you, Sandie. It was such a joy and pleasure and honor to be with you today.
Likewise. For more information about Dr. Michael Brant DeMaria's books, films, plays, and music, visit his website at michaeldemaria.com, and that's D-E, not D-I. This show is also available as a free downloadable podcast on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and all the major podcast platforms if you prefer to listen on the go. And that's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Michael Brant DeMaria.